85. The Disembodied Friend. Mr. Shen Emma of Shuntinfu, when a boy of 16, went to school at a Buddhist temple. There were a great many scholars besides himself, and among others, one named Chu, who said he came from Shantung. This Chu was a very hard-working fellow. He never seemed to be idle, and actually slept in the schoolroom, not going home at all. C.H. Wei-en became much attached to him, and one day asked him why he never went away. "Well, you see," replied Chu, "my people are very poor and can hardly afford to pay for my schooling. But by dint of working half the night, 2 of my days are equal to 3 of anybody else's." Thereupon Shen said he would bring his own bed to the school and that they would sleep there together. To which Chu replied that the teaching they got wasn't worth much, and that they would do better by putting themselves under a certain old scholar named Lai. This they were easily able to do, as the arrangement at the temple was monthly, and at the end of each month, anyone was free to go or to come. So off they went to this Mr. La, a man of considerable literary attainments, who had found himself in Shuntianfu without a cash in his pocket and was accordingly obliged to take pupils. He was delighted at getting 2 additions to his number and CHU showing himself an apt scholar. The 2 soon became very great friends, sleeping in the same room and eating at the same table. At the end of the month, CHU asked for leave of absence, and, to the astonishment of all, 10 days elapsed without anything being heard of him. It then chanced that Shen went to the Tianming temple, and there he saw CHU under one of the verandas, occupied in cutting wood for lucifer matches. The latter was much disconcerted by the arrival of Shen, who asked him why he had given up his studies. So the latter took him aside and explained that he was so poor as to be obliged to work half a month to scrape together funds enough for his next month's schooling. "You come along back with me," cried Shen on hearing this. "I will arrange for the payment," which CHU immediately consented to do on condition that Shen would keep the whole thing a profound secret. Now, Shen's father was a wealthy tradesman, and from his till Shen abstracted money wherewith to pay for Chu. And by, when his father found him out, he confessed why he had done so. Thereupon Shen's father called him a fool and would not let him resume his studies, at which Chu was much hurt and would have left the school too. But that old Mr. La discovered what had taken place and gave him the money to return to, Shen's father keeping him still at the school and treating him quite like his own son. So Shen studied no more, but whenever he met CHU, he always asked him to join in some refreshment at a restaurant, Chu invariably refusing, but yielding at length to his entreaties, being himself loath to break off their old acquaintanceship. Thus 2 years passed away when Shen's father died, and Shen went back to his books under the guidance of old Mr. Laya, who was very glad to see such determination. Of course, Shen was now far behind Chu, and in about 6 months Lu's son arrived, having begged his way in search of his father. So Mr. Lai gave up his school and returned home with a purse which his pupils had made up for him, Chu adding nothing thereto but his tears. At parting, Mr. Lo advised Shen to take Chu as his tutor, and this he did, establishing him comfortably in the house with him. The examination was very shortly to commence, and Shen felt convinced that he should not get through. But Chu said he thought he should be able to manage the matter for him. On the appointed day, he introduced Shen to a gentleman who he said was a cousin of his, named Liu, and asked Shen to accompany this cousin, which Shen was just proceeding to do when Chu pulled him back from behind, and he would have fallen down, but that the cousin pulled him up again, and then, after having scrutinized his appearance, carried him off to his own house. There being no ladies there, Shen was put into the inner apartments. And a few days afterwards, Liu said to him, "A great many people will be at the gardens today. Let us go and amuse ourselves a while, and afterwards I will send you home again." He then gave orders that a servant should proceed on ahead with tea and wine, and by they themselves went and were soon in the thick of the fate. Crossing over a bridge, they saw beneath an old willow tree a little painted skiff, and were soon on board, engaged in freely passing round the wine. However, finding this a little dull, Liu bade his servant go and see if Miss Li, the famous singing girl, was at home. And in a few minutes the servant returned bringing Miss Li with him. Shen had met her before, and so they at once exchanged greetings, while Liu begged her to be good enough to favor them with a song. Miss Li, who seemed laboring under a fit of melancholy, forthwith began a funeral dirge, at which Shen was not much pleased, and observed that such a theme was hardly suitable to the occasion. With a forced smile, Miss Li changed her key and gave them a love song. Whereupon Shen seized her hand and said, "There's that song of the Huanshu River which you sang once before. I have read it over several times, but have quite forgotten the words." Then Miss Li began, eyes overflowing with tears. She sits gazing into her glass. Lifting the bamboo screen, one of her comrades approaches. She bends her head and seems intent on her bow-like slippers, and forces her eyebrows to arch themselves into a smile. With her scarlet sleeve, she wipes the tears from her perfumed cheek, in fear and trembling lest they should guess the thoughts that overwhelm her. Shen repeated this over several times, until at length the skiff stopped, and they passed through a long veranda, where a great many verses had been inscribed on the walls, to which Shen at once proceeded to add a stanza of his own. Evening was now coming on, and Lu remarked that the candidates would be just about leaving the examination hall. So he escorted him back to his own home, and there left him. The room was dark, and there was no one with him. But by and by the servants ushered in someone whom at first he took to be Chu. However, he soon saw that it was not Chu, and in another moment the stranger had fallen against him and knocked him down. "Master's fainted," cried the servants as they ran to pick him up. And then Shen discovered that the one who had fallen down was really no other than himself. On getting up, he saw Chu standing by his side. And when they had sent away the servants, the latter said, "Don't be alarmed. I am nothing more than a disembodied spirit. My time for reappearing on Earth is long overdue, but I could not forget your great kindness to me. And accordingly, I have remained under this form in order to assist in the accomplishment of your wishes. The 3 bouts are over, and your ambition will be gratified." Shen then inquired if Chu could assist him in like manner for his doctor's degree, to which the latter replied, "Alas, the luck descending to you from your ancestors is not equal to that. They were a niggardly lot and unfit for the posthumous honors you would thus confer on them." Shen next asked him whither he was going, and Chu replied that he hoped, through the agency of his cousin, who was a clerk in purgatory, to be born again in old Mr. Lu's family. They then bade each other adieu, and when morning came, Shen set off to call on Miss Li, the singing girl. But on reaching her house, he found that she had been dead some days. He walked onto the gardens, and there he saw traces of verses that had been written on the walls and evidently rubbed out so as to be hardly decipherable. In a moment, it flashed across him that the verses and their composers belonged to the other world. Towards evening, Chu reappeared in high spirits, saying that he had succeeded in his design and had come to wish Shen a long farewell. Holding out his open palms, he requested Shen to write the word Chu on each. And then, after refusing to take a parting cup, he went away, telling Shen that the examination list would soon be out, and that they would meet again before long. Shen brushed away his tears and escorted him to the door, where a man who had been waiting for him laid his hand on Chu's head and pressed it downwards until Chu was perfectly flat. The man then put him in a sack and carried him off on his back. A few days afterwards, the list came out, and to his great joy, Xian found his name among the successful candidates. Whereupon he immediately started off to visit his old tutor, Mr. La. Now Mr. Lu's wife had had no children for 10 years, being about 50 years of age when suddenly she gave birth to a son, who was born with both fists doubled up so that no one could open them. On his arrival, Xian begged to see the child and declared that inside its hands would be found written the word Shu. Old Mr. La laughed at this, but no sooner had the child set eyes on Xian than both its fists opened spontaneously, and there was the word as Xian had said. The story was soon told, and Xian went home after making a handsome present to the family. And later on, when Mr. Lu went up for his doctor's degree and stayed at Xian's house, his son was 13 years old and had already matriculated as a candidate for literary honors.
Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more excellent content.